Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Welcome to the course Environmental Impact Assessments. In today's session, we will cover ecosystem services. This is the part 2 of ecosystem services in the larger ambit of EIA methods. In part 1 of ecosystem services, we looked at the challenges of including assessment of ecosystem services in the EIA process, and also looked at the definitions and concepts with examples, and then we also looked at the interrelationship between them. There are many guidances which are given on how to conduct assessment, ecosystem service assessments, which is available at various sources. Those sources are given to you for your reference purpose. Today we will look at methods used at the stage of scoping and baseline studies, as well as at the impact prediction and evaluation stage. So accordingly, our coverage will include that we'll look at the scoping and baseline studies, we'll look at what kind of entry points are there for scoping and ecosystem service review. Then we'll look at how to establish the spatial scope for the assessment purpose. Then we'll look at the sources of information and tools for scoping and baseline studies. Then we'll look at ecosystem services baseline assessments. How do you do that? And then how do you really prioritize, identify the priority ecosystem services, and then how do you really indicate the outcome of the scoping and baseline studies. Then we'll look at the impact prediction and evaluation, what kind of methods are available and what you really do in that particular stage. So the expected learning outcomes from you after completion of this session is that you should be able to determine what all steps would be needed and how to conduct them. So you should be able to tell what are the options available to you for entry points, what kind of decisions you should make to determine the spatial scope, and also enlist what kind of sources of information and tool will be available for you for scoping and baseline studies. Then you should be able to undertake or at least program the baseline assessment for your project. Then you should be able to define the priority ecosystem services and how do you really undertake that. Then you should be able to organize your assessment outcomes. Further, you should be able to identify different methods used under impact prediction and evaluation. So that's the expected learning outcomes. We are continuing to follow the chapter 8 from our textbook which we are following. The guidance suggests the use of benefit relevant indicators to structure assessments and link ecosystem capacity with use by different beneficiaries. So we see that the guidance which are available to us, they suggest that we should link it with the different beneficiaries. They may be monetary values but can also reflect less tangible non-use values. They can be difficult to quantify and are often excluded from EIA process, the evaluation process. In UK, the Department of Environment, Food and Rural Affairs published useful introductory guidance on valuing ecosystem services, which explains the strengths and limitation of different economic valuation techniques and gives examples of their application in policy and decision making. Looking into the scoping and baseline study stage, we'll look at how to work out the entry point for scoping. Entry point means how do you really get into from where do you start? How to establish the spatial scope. We will look at the sources of information and tools for scoping and baseline studies, how to undertake baseline assessment, prioritize ecosystem services, and then we'll look at how the outcomes of the study will be presented. Looking into scoping and baseline studies stage, scoping is an important stage in this particularly for the purpose of assessment of ecosystem services, because you will be able to incorporate ecosystem services into the process. So when you do it at the very beginning of it, you'll be able to incorporate it and you'll be able to integrate across the domain. So you can program it accordingly so that all the domains are integrated, and you will be able to allocate time and resources for the purpose and also plan the stakeholders' engagement. So you'll be needing a lot of stakeholders' engagement, so you can plan accordingly. At this stage, you determine the ecosystem services context for a planned project. You decide the context based on what's the likely impact sources. So what are the different sources, like what impact the different project activities would have on your ecosystem services. What are the ecosystems likely to be exposed to changes? So what are the services because of the other activities, because of the other sources? What are the possibility of they getting exposed to change? Who all are the beneficiaries? So you will also look to identify them and who would be affected by the proposed project. Based on your initial findings, so when you do the rapid assessments, based on those initial findings in the scoping phase, you would propose spatial scope or determine the scale of analysis, to what scale you're going to analyze, which should be undertaken for this particular assessment. You would propose temporal scope as well. So you would look at the time period, you would suggest for assessment, further detailed assessment to take place, the timeline which has to be followed. Then you would identify ecosystem services and their beneficiaries. So what are the services and what are the beneficiaries to be addressed in the further steps of the assessment. Looking at the entry point. Entry point for ecosystem service review, ESR, ecosystem service review, how you're going to review the ecosystem service. So what would be the entry point from where you would enter into analyzing the system? In the stage of scoping, you need to determine the entry point for the ecosystem service review. And ecosystem service are the multidimensional concept, as we have already discussed that it's a multidimensional concept. So you can start the assessment from different possible directions. So you can go from different dimensions of it. Therefore, you may determine the entry point for assessing impacts on them. You may select to start by mapping the proposed project activities and associated infrastructure against ecosystem services. So you might look at various project activities, what are those activities and what are the different ecosystem services and how are they being affected. So you can map them, you can start from there, that could be your entry point. This will help you to identify those activities and ecosystems for which there are likelihood of significant changes. So where there is likelihood of significant changes, you may identify them while you do the mapping. For example, during construction period, there can be considerable changes in the surrounding. You should note the ecosystem that might be affected because of their location within the project infrastructure footprint. So whatever is the footprint of your project, so those ecosystem services might be located in your project footprint, or because the project will change the biophysical environment. So it could be beyond the footprint and then your project might be changing those biophysical environments, or it might be changing the social setup that might change the ecosystem and ecosystem services supply. For example, there can be population growth, increase in population, and then the demand might change. So it might change the supply of it. It might impact ecosystem services, and it may even change the ability of people to access particular services. So the accessibility aspect, which we talked in the previous class, so it can also change their ability to access those particular services. So you might be blocking that, or you might be increasing their access. You'll be required to identify the potential users of these ecosystems as per the project activities. So you also need to map it, who are the potential users of these ecosystem services based on your project activities. You would be required to take care of the potential indirect effects, indirect impacts due to all project related infrastructure and related development. This will allow, so if you do this, this will allow you to cover the cumulative impacts on ecosystem services very well. Other entry point for your approach, like you have already seen by mapping, so the other entry point could be that you can identify people who use and depend on ecosystem services within a project's area of influence. So your project area could be limited, but the area of influence could be larger. So your services could be at that place as well. You can identify the services they use, and then you can consider how their ability to access them might be affected by the project's impact. So you can also look at the larger scale. This approach has some challenges. So when you take the second approach we talked about, this has some challenges. As users, you may find within the project area of influence, but you may not be able to find users located outside the project influence area. So you can take any entry points if you consider all the aspects carefully. So it doesn't matter what entry point you take, but if you're careful about all the aspects, so you can really take any entry point to start your analysis work. It is important that you share and integrate information across domain while undertaking the process. And particularly integration at this scoping stage will improve the baseline data collection. So it will be very beneficial if you do that right away at this stage. Now we'll look at how to establish the spatial scope. Defining the spatial scope of ecosystem services review can be challenging. So it can be very difficult because as services produced in the study area may be used by people considerable distance away. So whatever is being produced in your area, there might be users at different other places. So it might be difficult for you to recognize them. For example, the land use at the upstream can affect the exposure level at the downstream. So that whatever you use here, create a land use here, might affect the people downstream. While people within the study area may also benefit from services, so which may be happening at the other areas. So, like air quality regulation or recruitment of fish stock, which are largely or wholly produced by distance ecosystems. So something else is happening there, and your beneficiaries could be in your project area. So it makes it very complex. So in order to determine the ecosystem's ability to supply services to a particular group of people, you will have to necessarily consider the entire extent or distribution of the project influence area. So you might have to look at the larger entire extent here so that you may be able to determine the ecosystem functioning and overall viability. So it's very important at this stage. At this stage, you might need to take larger area compared to what is taken for other specific domain studies. So when you're studying water, air, and so on, you might be taking very specific area. But when you do ecosystem services, it is advisable to take a larger area because it will have specific advantage while you do undertake the entire process. In order to establish a suitable spatial scope for assessment purpose, you will require to gather information on the location of plant development. So first thing what you would be required to do is to get the location of the plant development or the infrastructure and activities and their associated zones of impact, effect, distance. So that you need to know, that you need to gather. Then you need to understand the distribution and extent of ecosystem that might be affected, including where direct land use changes will happen. So wherever you're going to, because you're going to do the development, you're going to change the land use. So where the direct land use change will happen. Any ecosystem with functional connectivity. So how you'll be connecting to those ecosystems. Where you have a functional connectivity, you need to identify them. If part watershed is affected, you should cover the entire watershed. So if you see that part watershed is been connected, there's a functional connectivity, then you should consider the entire watershed. Also, as per the land use change, because of the demographic change which your development might bring in, because of the there might be improvement in the infrastructure, there might be other impacts as well. So you need to look at that. So distribution or location of beneficiaries of ecosystem services affected by plant development and infrastructure. So how are they getting distributed, and what's the scale in which they are getting distributed. Now, looking at the source of information and tools for scoping and baseline studies. So for these are the information you need to get, and from where you will get these information. You may usually have to go forward and backward in the scoping and impact assessment. So it won't be a very streamlined process, but you would be going backward, forward. It will be iterative method for you, process for you. Practical starting point may be to map broad ecosystem types. So you have seen the types. So it would be advisable to map those broad ecosystem types and settlements infrastructure. You can see here one of the generic checklist of ecosystem services as per the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment categorization that can be used to identify the types of ecosystem services that different ecosystem can be expected to supply. You can take this and you can adapt to your context. So you can see here the checklist. Key sources you can use for information are, so from where all you can get information. So you can use satellite imagery, aerial photographs, or other sources showing the distribution, location of ecosystems and communities. You can look at ecological assessment and reports focusing on ecosystem types, distributions and conditions, and you may look at the threats and pressure affecting ecosystem and how they have changed over time. Information is needed on sustainable production, harvest, or yield if it's possible to get those information. Then you might look at the reports and information on the plant development and the design and location of the plant infrastructure and activities. So there will be already a proposal of the plant activities, so you need to look at that. Then you need to look at these social reports and results of initial stakeholders engagement. So you look at what engagement has been there and what consultation process has taken place. And then you need to look at the demographic profile, cultural, economic characteristic, and uses of dependency on natural resources and ecosystems. So you need to profile that. You have to engage actively with specialists from ecological and social practitioners and development proponents for good assessment. So it is required that you engage actively with different specialists, as well as you need to engage with the proponents and also with the community. You may have to engage with the other specialists as well, so not only with your domain from ecology and social practitioners, but as well as from the other domain as well, because you need to require to integrate all the information. You'll also have to engage with the stakeholders, affected and interested parties through participatory approach. This will ensure the ecosystem service review is framed well. So review which you're planning is framed well to address key issues of the concerns of the stakeholders. So when you engage them early in the stage, then it ensures that their agendas are included here. It is advisable that you engage with stakeholders at the earliest stage possible to obtain essential information in social and ecological surveys, else you'll be out of time at a later stage. You will also have to identify possible links between ecosystems and users. So you need to look at the links. This will allow you to identify particular benefits that users take from these sources. So that a link would help you to identify the benefits and the beneficiaries. You can take this information from the secondary sources. So looking at the other reports might help you to process this information. You may also have to undertake specific baseline investigations if required. So if secondary data is not enough, then you might have to take a baseline investigation. In the figure, you can see examples of many intra and interrelationships that may exist between ecosystems, services, and benefits. Each ecosystem might provide many benefits to many different users. Equally, one group of people may use multiple services to derive all the benefits they need. So they must be accessing a lot of other services as well. So you look at this linkages, ecosystem with benefits, and this is taken from the oil development project in Uganda. You can see how complex the interrelationship is. So you can see the network diagram there, how complex the interrelationship is and how complex it will be to assess and manage information. For this purpose, you can draw flowcharts or network diagrams for effective understanding and communicating impact. You may also construct a causal chain diagram, also known as path model or means end diagram. This will help you to track how a project action or impact can propagate through ecosystems. And eventually, after changes in the provision of ecosystem services and benefits to particular beneficiary group. Causal chain, commonly used in ecological assessments, it's very commonly used. A causal chain in an ecosystem service assessment will show in the end the effects of changes on our well-being or the benefit which we get. So that should be the end product which we are looking at. During the scoping and the baseline studies, it is also necessary to understand pattern of supply and use without planned development. So you look at without the planned development so that it is possible to predict how these can be expected to change as results of development in the impact assessment. So you would be looking at both the scenario with the development and without the development, how the future would look like. Sometimes sufficient baseline understanding is available at the scoping stage, but often there are important gaps. So then that you need to come back to that stage. Risks from unplanned events or accidents should also be considered while you're doing the scoping. Now, looking at the ecosystem services baseline assessment, you will find it challenging to develop a reliable baseline for ecosystem services because of need to obtain information on several aspects, such as you would be required to obtain information on current levels of ecosystem service supply, use, and benefits. You would be required to identify the interrelationship between supply, use, and benefit. Then you also look at the future supply and use in absence of planned project. You would be looking, taking account of existing threats, pressures, and their relationship with people's livelihoods. You would be also taking care of the health, safety, and cultural benefits. You will face the challenge to find data on relevant information, and information may vary between projects. So what applies for one project might vary for the other project. You have to ensure that all assumptions are stated well in the assessment report, or the assumptions and data limitations are all mentioned. These information inform about certain limitation of the conclusions you are drawing about the database. So it's very important that you clearly state the entire process, the assumptions, and what data limitations you're encountering. Any oversight may have serious implication for livelihood and well-being. You might have to even design studies if existing information studies are limited. So if you do not have substantial study, what secondary sources are telling you, then you might have to design a study to undertake a baseline study here. Many secondary data you can collect which include like you can collect land cover and land use mapping, then you can do vegetation survey and classification. You can undertake surveys of biodiversity and ecosystems, ethnobotanical surveys, you can take agriculture surveys, social impact assessment and results of stakeholders which might be available, health impact assessment might be available, livelihood surveys, water studies. So you can access these secondary data.